Good morning, Excellencies and distinguished guests. I'm former Senator Joe Donnelly, the chairman of the board for the Soufan Center, the organizer of this forum, along with key strategic partners including Qatar International Academy for Security Studies, New America, Defense One, and the United Nations Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. I'd like to welcome you for what is sure to be a fascinating forum, even if we're doing it virtually this year, as we're unfortunately unable to be all physically together in the same location due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Nevertheless, I'd like to thank the government of the state of Qatar for their support in fostering a space for the open and honest exchange of ideas. As you may recall, many of you were in Doha 2 years ago when we gathered for the forum on returning foreign terrorist fighters. Our inaugural forum in 2018 gathered government officials, policymakers, and subject matter experts from around the world and across multiple sectors in order to focus on the challenge of returning foreign terrorist fighters. Last year, in 2019, we convened ministers, ambassadors, intelligence analysts, and human rights experts to address the security threat of modern disinformation. This year, we gather some of the sharpest minds and deepest thinkers in the field to discuss the topic: a new world disorder, managing security challenges in an increasingly complex landscape. On January 7th, 2020, the Soufan Center highlighted an intel brief that explored how a range of challenges would significantly impact global security over the course of the year and beyond, including an international system shifting from unipolar to multipolar, the globalization of white supremacy extremism, and the evolution of other forms of transnational terrorism, the continued proliferation of disinformation in foreign influence operations, and the momentum of worldwide protest movements. The challenges we identified are interconnected. They have been and will continue to be impacted by developments in emerging technologies, demographic shifts, and a range of socio-cultural factors. On January 27, 2020, the Soufan Center published another intel brief titled "The Global Health Challenges Posed by the Spread of Deadly Viruses," as we were among one of the first institutions to begin to analyze the potential for the coronavirus to morph into a worldwide pandemic. COVID-19 has made a tenuous security environment even more complex and unstable. Let me assure you, this year's forum will not disappoint. We have 4 days of keynote speeches, fireside chats, and discussion panels with an all-star cast assembled from government, academia, think tanks, Hollywood, and Silicon Valley. Over the next several days, the forum will provide a strategic assessment of the security landscape, go in depth with policymakers and practitioners to discuss unique approaches to thinking about and responding to regional and national security challenges, evaluate the impact of disinformation, and trace the evolving nature of the global information environment, and conclude with an overview of how popular culture views these threats and challenges. Many of the security challenges posed by this new world disorder can only be tackled by countries working together, marshaling the innovation of the private sector, and harnessing the fortitude and compassion of their citizens. 2020 has been full of setbacks and surprises, but I remain optimistic that 2021 will bring hope and prosperity. The themes discussed at this year's forum are at the very forefront of the most pressing issues facing the world today. We hope you all learn a lot from this forum, from the speakers, and from the attendees. Use this time to network, to exchange best practices, to exchange lessons learned, and to share innovative, methodological approaches. Expectations are high, and rightfully so. The speakers we have are top-notch, from around the world with new and diverse perspectives and insights. We're hoping the ideas and proposals shared today will become the solutions to address the challenges we face collectively. Thanks so much. And once again, thanks to our gracious hosts, speakers, organizers, and partners. It's going to be a great forum.
And first, we'd like to thank the Soufan Group, Ali Soufan, for giving us this opportunity to speak on Mr. O'Brien's behalf. They've asked us to speak from the heart, and we believe that'll be very easy for us because Mr. O'Brien has touched our hearts so deeply. Mr. O'Brien has restored our faith in the U.S. government. We thank him for our relationship that we've nurtured with him in the 3 meetings that we've had. Mr. O'Brien, as you recall, when you came to Phoenix to help us dedicate the painting Into the Breach, our Governor Doug Ducey said, "Not all heroes wear uniforms. You, sir, are one of those heroes."
I want to thank Robert O'Brien and the Trump administration for their leadership in prioritizing the return of innocent Americans held hostage abroad. I am forever grateful for your dedication to this nonpartisan issue.
Hello, Ambassador and attendees. Sam Goodwin here. Thank you, Ali, for this opportunity. Since meeting Ambassador O'Brien, I've learned that as the hostage envoy, he always carried with him a set of cards, and on each card were the details of an American hostage missing overseas. On a recent trip to Washington, I had the great honor of meeting Ambassador O'Brien's wife, Lo Marie, and she told me that every single night, Robert would sit at home, look through these cards, trying to determine what more could possibly be done on each case. When I was released from Syria, Ambassador O'Brien sent me my card in the mail. And today, I probably look at it as much as he did. It's one of the best reminders of how fortunate I was and how grateful I am to be here today. Ambassador, as you know, my family and I could not be more appreciative of all you did.
You may not get a medal, but you're a hero to those 50+ families that you've reunited through the work of you and your colleagues bringing home the hostages. No one knows better the pain than those that have lost family members to terrorists and to hostage taking. For the rest of your life, sir, you will have the joy in knowing that you have reunited so many families through your hard work. We thank you for that.
Good morning, Ambassador O'Brien. Carl and I are truly honored to be a part of this, and we're grateful for Ollie for letting us do this. It is hard to express the love we have for you and Mrs. O'Brien and Cash. You have done so very much for us and continue to do for us. We know that with your help, we will be able to find Kayla and bring her home. And all the hostage families and the hostages that have returned home, the joy they must have and the thoughts they must have about you. Thank you.
Heartfelt thanks.
Thank you so much.
We love you dearly.
Wow, what a punctuation point to start our discussion today at the Global Security Forum. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm Steve Clemens. I'm editor-at-large of The Hill. And we have a great guest who is referred to in the comments that you just heard from families of hostages and those people that our guest that I'm about to have a conversation with has touched. Let me just say a few words about Ambassador Robert O'Brien, National Security Advisor to President Trump. One of my favorite things about him is he's a Bruin from UCLA. That's something we have in common. He's, has a distinguished history across the board on U.S. national security law and policy. He was, before his present post, special presidential envoy for hostage affairs and was made an ambassador a year into that job. And since September 18th, 2019, it sort of seems like a lot has happened over that last year and a couple of months. Robert O'Brien has been the fourth national security advisor to the president. So Ambassador O'Brien, it's terrific to be with you today. And I would love to just get your thoughts and reactions to that video and ask you to share with us as well, what does your dashboard look like? What is your strategic priorities as you go into work every day and you think about the national security priorities of the country? What does that look like?
Well, thank you, Steve, for that generous introduction, and thank you, Ali, for hosting me today. As you know, Ali is an incredible patriot who served our nation with real distinction. In responding to the video, let me just take a moment to tell you how humbled I am to see the Muellers and Diane and Sam Goodwin. They're great Americans, and for the Muellers and the Foleys, I can't imagine the loss and the sense of loss that they have for their kids, who were great kids doing amazing things. Kayla was a heck of a humanitarian and had done amazing things in her young life, and I wish I'd had the opportunity to meet her. And the same with Jim Foley, with James Foley, as a great young journalist and who had tremendous potential ahead of him. And Sam is just a terrific, charismatic young man who's got great things ahead of him. One of the things that in this job or in my prior job as a hostage envoy, you don't really think about so much of the people you brought home. And I'm grateful that we've been able to work with President Trump and Secretary Pompeo and others and our team, Cash and others, to bring so many people home. But my thoughts are still with the families that have loved ones who aren't home yet. And so every day I continue to think about Austin Tice, for example, or Jeff Woodkey, or the Sitko 6. We've got some detainees in Russia, Whelan, Reed, and Calvi. I'm thinking about them and others every day, and we hope to bring them home. And when they're home, we'll have a real opportunity to rejoice. But it was quite an honor to be mentioned, and the extraordinarily generous comments that Sam and Diana and Carl and Marcia had touched my heart, and it's something I won't forget. Let me bring you greetings from the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. Over the past 4 years, President Trump has put protecting the American people first, their needs, their safety, their rights, and their values. And he's pursued, as Ronald Reagan did, a policy of peace through strength. He's dealt with the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. President Trump has exposed and stood up to malign authoritarian regimes instead of turning a blind eye to their conduct while merely hoping for change. The president has also done the hard work of strengthening our alliance and partnerships. And in so doing so, he has insisted on substance over style, which is something new that we haven't seen for many years. We believe the world is more peaceful and more prosperous in many ways because of the president's policies. One area that the president has had tremendous success on is in counterterrorism and hostage recovery. The ISIS physical caliphate, once the size of Great Britain, is gone. We brought ISIS founder Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and other top ISIS leaders to justice. And consequently, over 7.5 million people have been freed from ISIS's oppressive rule. We've also brought 2 Islamic State detainees, the so-called Beatles, back to the United States, where they'll be tried in court for the kidnapping, detention, and brutal execution of 4 American citizens, Sotloff, Mueller, Foley, Kasich. We won't forget them. They'll be brought to justice, and justice will be served on them. Under the president's leadership, the United States has also degraded al-Qaeda, with many of its key leaders dead, including AQIM leader Abdul Malik Drukdal, AQAP leader Qasem al-Rimi, and AQIS leader Azam Umar. Al-Qaeda has been incapable of directing a complex, large-scale attack against the U.S. because of the pressure that we've kept on them, and there's more to come. The Iranian regime, the #1 state sponsor of terrorism, is more contained than it has been in years. Its revenue has been reduced to the lowest levels in history by the largest economic pressure campaign since the Cold War. To further this end, the United States has designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization. President Trump has also taken unprecedented action against Hezbollah, the world's most heavily armed terrorist group whose diverse collection of advanced weapons and thousands of rockets and missiles threaten our partner Israel. And for years, Hezbollah has been gathering intelligence, stockpiling weapons, building explosive caches, and plotting attacks in Europe, Asia, Africa, North and South America. And it sent its senior commanders across the Middle East to oversee operations and exacerbate sectarian tensions. Finally, to supplant its hundreds of millions of dollars it receives from Iran each year, Hezbollah launders money and helps drug cartels move cocaine into Europe and the United States. Under President Trump, there's been no higher priority than the safety and security of American citizens. The U.S. government has worked tirelessly to secure the freedom of Americans and citizens of our allies held in captivity. And since the beginning of the administration, we've rescued over 56 hostages and detainees in more than 24 countries and returned them home to their loved ones. And this unprecedented success has been achieved by leveraging the full weight and scope of tools available to the U.S. government, as well as in some cases our allies around the world and our partners in the private sector. And they know who they are, and we're grateful to them. In addition to these important successes, the president has built a new international consensus on China. He's taken unprecedented action to counter Chinese aggression, theft, and human rights abuses, and dramatically expanded our cooperation with allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. On the trade front, NAFTA has been replaced with a much improved USMCA. Working with leaders from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, President Trump has reduced undocumented migration from these nations by 85%. We've strengthened our relationship with the hemisphere's second biggest democracy and unlocked billions of dollars in loans to small and mid-sized enterprises and infrastructure projects in Brazil and other places in the Western Hemisphere through our America Cresce, or Growth in the Americas initiative. I was just in Brazil at President Trump's request just a week before the election to help cement that alliance with our critical ally in the Western Hemisphere, Brazil. It's a vast and populous democracy, and America will be stronger because of that partnership that we have with Brazil and President Bolsonaro. President Trump convinced our NATO allies to increase their defense spending by $400 billion to 2024. After years of devastating defense sequestration here at home, our military is being rebuilt. We signed a peace agreement with the Taliban after 19 years of war. And with America's help, Serbia and Kosovo normalized their economic relationship. In the Middle East, an area that many of you are familiar with, President Trump achieved a truly historic peace agreement between the United Arab Emirates, UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Israel. We call them the Abraham Accords in English, or the Avram Accords in Hebrew, or the Abraham Accords in Arabic. They represent the most significant step forward in peace in the Middle East in over 25 years. Diverse challenges to our national security remain, from Russia to Iran to North Korea to Venezuela, to the continued threat of extremist terrorism to transnational criminal organizations. But the results of the president's policy speak for themselves. We're safer than when the president took office. The fight for security and freedom goes on. Ali and many of you here are heroes in that fight, and it's a fight we must stay in, no matter what happens on the political front in the United States. Thank you. God bless you all, and God bless the United States of America. And Steve, with those opening remarks, I'd love to have a conversation with you and answer some of the questions you might have.
Great. Well, Ambassador O'Brien, thank you. You covered a lot of turf, so I think we'll work on unpacking some of that. But let me ask you first about hostages and where they sit as a priority in our national security thinking. And what I'm specifically interested in is oftentimes we see shadowy groups who have kidnapped, detained, killed, harassed people. But if you look just beyond those shadowy groups, they're often governments pulling the strings. What are we doing to deter this as an act essentially of states and non-state actors?
No, that's a great question. And oftentimes we divide hostages into two categories: hostages, which are taken by non-governmental actors, the JNIMs, the Al-Qaedas, the ISISs of the world, and detainees. They might be held by Russia, they might be held by Iran, Syria, or another bad actor. I think the president cut through a lot of this. When I first started working with him in my prior position, he just referred to them as all hostages. If they were an American who was taken by a government or by an organization, maybe an organization that had a state sponsor behind them, his position is they were hostages. They were being used as bargaining chips in some way to either humiliate the U.S. or to punish someone just because of their status as a U.S. citizen, or an attempt to gain ransom for an organization so that they could further their terrorist goals or their criminal activities. And the president's position was, and I think this is the essence, when people ask what America First means, I don't think there's any place outside the hostage world or the detainee world where it's a more pure distillation of how the president feels about getting our folks home. And he doesn't care why they were there, what they were doing when they were taking hostage. He doesn't care about their background. He doesn't care about their political affiliation, their religion. If there's an American who's taken overseas, he wants them home. And I think that he's personally offended that either a government or a terrorist organization would take an American hostage. And so he's made it literally one of the top priorities. I don't think we've ever seen a president put the return of wrongful detainees or hostages at the top of his foreign policy agenda or his national security agenda. But it makes sense because when the president spends so much time and effort on individual Americans who are taken abroad, our adversaries understand that he means business, and our friends know that he's gonna put American interests first. And I don't think there's a more important American interest than getting our citizens home when they've been wrongfully taken.
One of the high-profile cases that you mentioned in your earlier comments is one that's unresolved, and that is the case of Austin Tice. Many people think that he's held in Syria. There have been reports of high-level talks with Syria on a number of fronts, but also hostages. Reports that Kash Patel, who's now, of course, rising in the Department of Defense, and others, has been involved in this. Where do those talks stand now? And do you see a pathway? And let me just ask you candidly: have the Syrians finally admitted to having the influence to potentially get Austin Tice released?
Yeah, so Steve, those are all great questions, and I'd love to talk more to you and to the folks the viewers on this, but I can't really comment on what's happening at this point. I know there have been press reports about high-level interactions, and that Mr. Patel and Ambassador Carstens, who took my job as the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, were in Syria. What I can tell you is that we're using every tool, every lever we have to get Austin out. It's been something I've thought about every day as the hostage envoy, and every day as national security advisor, is how we get Mark and Deborah's son back to them, get him back to his friends and family in Texas. It's been a very frustrating case, but we're using every tool, whether it's through allies, whether it's through adversaries, whether it's We're doing everything we can to get Austin back, and we would like to get him back. And I'd like to see him back, and I know the president would like to see him back before he leaves office. But I can't comment further on the case at this time.
I understand that, and I think we all wish you well in those efforts. Let me ask you another question. I'm sort of, I don't know where the audience is, and we may lose them in this, but I'm a real nerd and wonk when it comes to studying the National Security Council over many years under very different leaders, and I am interested in how you see the national security decision-making process. Who needs to be in the room? How is it structured? Of course, we recently lost Brent Scowcroft, who many people I knew very well, but many people look at him as one of the ideal national security advisors. And I'd just be interested in how you compare the way you've structured the decision-making process with maybe, let's pick a few, Susan Rice, Zbig Brzezinski, Brent Scowcroft. What does a president need and expect and should have in the structural dimensions of national security decision-making?
Well, when you reel off those names, the people that have held the office before me, I think I'm the 28th National Security Advisor, and there have been just some giants in American national security and foreign policy who've sat in that office. Many of them have been extraordinarily kind in sharing their wisdom with me and talking about how to organize the National Security Council. One of the things I did is when I first took office is I reached out to a number of my predecessors, starting with Henry Kissinger and going down and predecessors from both sides of the aisle to ask them their thoughts and to get their insight. The one thing I wanted to do, and all of them confirmed it, is I wanted to follow the model that Brent Scowcroft had for the National Security Council. I think he was a very effective national security advisor. Now, I didn't want to be a cliche, though, because every national security advisor who comes into office, as you know, Steve, having followed this, the first thing they say is we're going to have the Scowcroft model in our National Security Council. And they may or may not have the Scowcroft model, but everyone, that's almost like a religious incantation. But I took a look at what Brent did. I talked to folks who worked with Brent on either his executive secretary, his deputies, or others. And I think there are a couple of things that exemplify the Scowcroft model. Number one is being an honest broker. I don't think you can have your own agenda as the national security advisor. And I think when you have your own agenda, or you're pushing your own agenda, it makes you less effective as a convening power. I mean, the power I have as a senior staffer to the president is to bring together the cabinet secretaries, the department heads, try and get their very best views on an issue, to get their very best advice for the president, to get their counsel on what course of action we should take, whether it's a long-term problem or a crisis that we're facing that day, and then get those options to the president. Hopefully we can arrive at some consensus, but if there's not a consensus, to get them their day in court. And to do that, I think being an honest broker elicits the views and elicits the good faith arguments from the various folks that we're working with, the men and women who make up the cabinet. So that's number one. Number two goes to this idea of having your day in court. You're not always going to have a consensus on these issues, and if you did, it probably wouldn't be a great process. You really want some give and take, especially when you're dealing with some of these critical issues of the day, whether it's China or Russia or Iran or Syria or international terrorism or transnational organized crime. Different departments have different equities, different cabinet secretaries or department heads look at things differently. And so that having a process whereby they can get together, have their views exchanged, and then understand that if they're on the minority, that they'll get their day in court with the president, or with the national security advisor if it's depending on the issue, or with the president if it's a big enough issue to go to his desk. And so I think what we've tried to do is run a very effective process. We've had, I think, almost half the deputies committee meetings and principal committee meetings that have been held during the Trump administration have taken place over the past 15 months while I've been national security advisor. I think it's important to get everyone together to hear their views. And then we've had many occasions where there was a split in opinions where we go to the president. And again, by being the honest broker and taking that to the president and letting the senior officials give voice to their case, to argue their case to the president, to have their day in court. The president may ask me to weigh in later, but I try and make sure that he gets the views directly from his cabinet folks. And I think the third part of the Scowcroft model, if you take being an honest broker and running an efficient process and giving folks their day in court, is for the NSC not to be operational. There's a little twist on that under PPD 30 with hostages, where we're maybe a little bit more operational on the hostage front than we would be in other areas. But that is, our job is to convene, to get the president the best advice and options, and then to let the departments and agencies implement those policies. The State Department's much better suited to do international diplomacy than the NSC. Now, that doesn't mean I won't meet with my counterparts, other national security advisors. I might meet with heads of state on behalf of the president. But the day-to-day diplomacy of the United States should be run by the State Department. Our military operations should be run by the DoD. Our Homeland Security operations by the Department of Homeland Security. Our counterterrorism and counterintelligence should be run by the FBI and DOJ. So I think that's the third part of it, is not to have an operational NSC where you're recreating a mini Department of State or a mini Department of Defense over on West Exec Avenue next to the White House, but to make sure that, excuse me, once the president has made a decision and has had a policy, that policy is implemented by the department. So I think those are three of the hallmarks of the Scowcroft model, and we've really we've strived to do to operate the NSC in that fashion. And I was just recently with Governor Huntsman out in Utah speaking at the Orrin Hatch Foundation, and one of the kindest compliments that I've been paid in this job is, and he's worked with, I think, 7 or 8 national security advisors. He's been a 4-time ambassador. He said he hasn't seen a National Security Council since Brent Scowcroft run with the quote Scowcroft model the way we've been able to pursue it. And look, that's not a credit to me. That's a credit to the president and empowering us to do it, and a credit to the team that we put together at the NSC that has been able to operate in that fashion. So I owe a lot to Brent. It was a tough loss, but he was General Scowcroft was really a giant in the national security world, and so I couldn't have been more proud to hear people say that we've done something similar to what he did. It's quite a compliment.
I'm glad to hear John Huntsman's comments. John's an old friend, and I know that he does not flatter. So that's even, it speaks even better to his comments. Let me just say something. You raised something I think is very important. Talking about the non-operational. Many of us in the media, I'm in the media. We're always looking for collisions, fights. Personality contests. Looking at what does John Bolton and his worldview bring. But what you said is very, very important, and I think it's important that people understand and hear it. Is that I get this sense, and I want to ask you about this, that you are elevating other people's views. You are elevating, Mark Milley's views, with whom you are reported to have some differences. My question to you is, do your views matter at the end of the day as a person, an individual in this process? And do you find yourself able to still be a good steward of those with whom you disagree as you bring those decisions to the president? So it's really kind of an interesting thing, because I used to talk to General Scowcroft, and he said, yeah, I had views, I had differences, but it didn't mean that I undermined the views of others. So just love to get your take on that.
No, I think that's a great question. I think it's one of the things that the National Security Advisor has to decide at the beginning of their tenure, how they're going to operate. And look, I've got well-developed opinions on lots of issues. I've published, hundreds of articles and op-eds over the years. I've spoken out. Every once in a while, somebody will go find a prior speech or a news clip from CNN or Fox or something and put it on Twitter to show what I said 4 or 8 years ago, or in another presidential campaign, perhaps. And so, look, I've got well-developed views on a lot of the issues that we face, but my role is not to promote my views. My role is to promote the president's policies. And for the president to make the best decisions, he's got to get the input from his chief advisors, whether it's Mark Milley, who's a close friend, and I don't think Mark and I have had any disagreements. What happens with the press is there's this effort in Washington. They always want to have a protagonist and antagonist and put together some sort of.
It's what we do.
And again, I'm not blaming him, but there was a lot written about Mark Esper and myself. I never wanted Mark Esper's job. I just wanted to see Mark Esper succeed and do a great job as Secretary of Defense. And but there were stories about me being in some sort of an adverse relationship with Mark or with Mark Milley, both of whom I consider to be friends and good men. So I think that's kind of a Washington thing. My goal is to make sure that the president gets the views of his cabinet. Now, there are many times that the president will then turn to me at the end of a discussion, or it may be in private, that he'll turn to me and say, what do you think? What's your opinion? And look, that's my role as the National Security Advisor, is to then answer the president's question, give him my best advice. It's something I did in a different field as a lawyer for much of my career. And I always tried to make that advice as confidential as possible. But again, it was guided by what the president's instincts were. there were times my advice might be something different than what the president ultimately did, and that's fine. That's not something I should, that's not something to emphasize or to make a dispute out. The president is the decider. He's elected by the American people. I'm hired by him to staff him and to give him the best advice I can. And once the president makes a decision, that's what we go out and move out and try and implement.
I mean, I don't mean this next question facetiously, although it may sound like that. He's gone through 4 national security advisors. So, General Mike Flynn, we had General H.R. McMaster, we had John Bolton. Each brought a very different style. H.R. was famous for, lots of charts and numbers. And I'm just interesting. It does appear to outsiders who watch you in this role that you are more successful in getting the president's attention and direction. So what can you share with us works with the president? What is the secret of your success? Do you use pie charts?
So look, the president is a voracious consumer of intelligence and the information that we provide him. And so he looks at charts, he looks at maps. I think he's got a very innate sense of geography, and so he'll spend a lot of time poring over maps and charts and that sort of thing. But again, that's to convey information to him. It's not for me to try and shape his worldview. One of the things that, and I normally don't mention what the president and I discussed, but I'll make an exception here. When I spoke with him about the job and whether I was the right candidate for the job, I was pretty upfront with him and said, you've hired a couple of national security advisors prior to me that felt it was their job to educate you about the world, to shape your views, to tell you what you ought to be thinking. I don't view the national security advisor's role as being some sort of tutor on international affairs. The president's a very accomplished man. He's had a long international business career. He'd been president of the United States for 3 years. When I joined him as national security advisor, I'd been working with him prior in a different capacity. I said, you've got a well-developed sense of what you want to do. I view my job as making sure you get all the best options you have that are available for you to implement the policy that you want. And so I think maybe it was a different approach than my predecessors, and good men all. And but I'm very cognizant of the fact that I'm not there as the principal. The president is the principal in this equation, and I'm there to get him the best options, to give him the best advice, and to give him my most candid best advice, but in private, not leaking it out to the news media about the fact that I felt one way and the president felt a different way. My effectiveness, I think, comes from the fact that he can rely on me to give him good advice, to get him the best options, and then to implement his policies.
Thank you for that. I want to turn to something else. I don't want to mention, which I failed to do before, because not only have you written like tons of articles out there, you wrote a book in 2016 titled "While America Slept: Restoring Leadership to a World in Crisis." And so I want to ask you about the Abraham Accords, and as you said, the Abraham Accords, depending on where you sit on this, and wondering, because a lot of people and observers, Council on Foreign Relations types, the Chinese government, see America in some kind of strategic contraction. We can debate that one way or another. But this is something where you're kind of looking at the Middle East and a changing of the map there. Ambassador Yusuf Otaiba said they felt they needed to take action both to change the dynamic in the region, but also stop the annexation of the West Bank. I'm interested in that dynamic, in whether or not you think there's going to be a different vector forward now in the Abraham Accords, and how you saw that as the pieces were coming together. Well, and whether it's an example of American leadership reasserting itself.
Yeah. Well, look, I think it's a tremendous example of American leadership, and I don't think the Accords would have happened without American leadership. I mean, when you think of 70 years of modern Israeli history from the partition in 48 until now, up until recently, there had only been 2 peace accords, the peace accord with Jordan and the peace accord with Egypt, 2 neighbors. 26 years since the Jordanian deal had been done. And I think it was common wisdom in kind of the establishment foreign policy circles and among colleagues and friends of mine that you had to solve the Palestinian problem first before you could get to any other peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And I think President Trump approached this very differently. The first thing he did is he built political capital. He built political capital in Israel by moving our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That's something every presidential candidate from both parties for 40 years has promised to do. But as soon as they get into office, they're told, well, you can't do it. It'll be bad for the street. There'll be uprisings. It'll be terrible for America. And the president said, look, I made this promise. I'm going to keep the promise. I'm going to move the capital to Jerusalem. He recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. I mean, the idea that that Israel was ever going to give back the Golan Heights as strategic territory to Bashar al-Assad or whoever comes after him in Syria was ridiculous. That was never going to happen. And we recognized the reality of it. So he built a tremendous amount of political capital there. On the Gulf Arab front, he pulled out of the disastrous JCPOA, which was the worst form of appeasement that the West has engaged in since Munich. I mean, it's. I'm not going to go through the details on it. I've written about it. It was a terrible deal to give the Iranian regime, the number one state sponsor of terrorism, $150 billion in sanctions relief, plus a bunch of cash for hostages, only encouraged their bad behavior. And we saw it in Yemen, we saw it in Syria, we saw it in Iraq. We've seen it in Lebanon, Yemen, throughout the region. So the president built political capital by standing behind our allies in the Gulf, UAE, Saudi, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, which is a little bit of the Switzerland in the Middle East. But we showed our allies in the Gulf that we'd stand behind them. We got out of JCPOA. We supported them against Iran. And then the president did something very unique for politicians. And I've watched politicians for my entire adult life. They get some political capital, and they want to nurture it, and they want to look at it, and they want to lock it away in a cupboard, and then they open it every once in a while and take a look at the political capital. Politicians have a very difficult time spending their political capital, and that's just what the president did. First of all, he used the political capital he developed with the Israelis, and worked them very hard not to extend sovereignty and not to annex portions of the West Bank, and to set the stage for a potential deal with the Arabs. He uses political capital with the Arab countries because of all the security that we provided them, to let them know, hey, this is something that's very important to us. And he brought the parties together. And we got these historic accords, and we had 3 deals done in the course of a month, something that had more deals than had been done in 70 years. And it was really a testament to the president's leadership. It had the effect of isolating Iran. It had the effect of showing that America is still the leader in the Middle East when it comes to diplomacy, when it comes to economic leadership. And I also want to comment, it's just not about the president. I want to call out King Hamad and Mohammed bin Zayed and Prime Minister Hamdouk, Prime Minister Netanyahu. Look, it's very dangerous to make peace in the Middle East. We saw that with Anwar Sadat. We saw that with Yitzhak Rabin. People have literally given up their lives as they've attempted to obtain peace. And so those leaders, MBZ and Hamad and Hamdouk and Netanyahu, they showed a tremendous amount of personal courage, not just political courage, but they showed personal courage in entering into these deals. And now to see what's happening, we've got what I call a warm peace. I mean, the peace between Israel and Jordan and Egypt, where maybe can be characterized as cold pieces. No war, which is great, diplomatic relations, but not a lot of interaction between the people. We're seeing these flights now going back and forth. We've got Emirati Airlines flying into Emirates, flying into Israel. We've got El Al flying into Abu Dhabi. We have tourists coming to both places. We have Arab religious pilgrims coming to the Temple Mount and coming up to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Blue Mosque on the Temple Mount to see one of the holiest sites in Islam, making a Hajj, if you will, there, just like they can do with Mecca and Medina. We're seeing investment taking place between the countries. These great sovereign wealth funds in the UAE are investing in tech companies in Israel. This is all happening very quickly, and I think it's going to be a legacy of the Trump administration. This peace is breaking out. And look, we think, and I hope that if the current lawsuits don't work out for the president and President Biden becomes our next president, I really hope that a Biden-Harris administration is going to pursue the Abraham Accords, because there are a number of other countries that are teed up to join. And look, it's a signal to Iran, it's a signal to our adversaries around the world that America is back in the game, and that we really can help foster peace. And it's a great legacy for the president to have as he leaves office.
Well, look, you and I studied poli-sci in the same place, continuity, discontinuity. And I think what you just said about the opportunity for continuity here is very important. Just really fast, depending on how you look at it in this whole thing, if you've just got a couple of months left, you think you'll be able to solve the embargo of Qatar and create peace there. Because it is a little ironic that our other partner in the region, where our biggest military base in the region, that flights there, private flights, commercial flights, are dependent upon Iran. So I'm just wondering, will you think there'll be any kind of resorting of that, which I know has also been an interest of yours?
No, we've been working very hard on that. The president's made countless calls to the leaders of the Gulf states. It's in our interest to have the GCC come together. It's in our America's interest to have harmonious relationships within the GCC, because that provides an important counterbalance to Iran. It would open up the opportunity for more peace deals with Israel, and creating a real economic opportunity zone across the Middle East, and even being able to take that out to other parts of the Muslim and the Arab world. So we'd like to get that rift solved. We felt that solving the Airlink issue that you referred to, that making sure that Qatar Air that Qatar was able to fly over Saudi airspace or Bahraini airspace is an important first step in solving that rift. I'd like to see that get done before, if we end up leaving office, I'd like to see that get done in the next 70 days. And I think there's a possibility for it. We're in a unique position because we've got great relations with Qatar. I've spent a lot of time in Doha, as a lot of folks on this call probably have, and spent a lot of time in Abu Dhabi and in Riyadh. And so, look, these are all cousins. These are friends. This is really kind of a family
Right.
dispute. And like family disputes, sometimes those are the hardest to solve. But we'd like to get all these cousins back together at the Thanksgiving table, so to speak. And it's something we're working on, and we're going to keep working on it as long as the president's in office. It's something that'll be a priority for us.
Well, that's great. I want to ask you about something else. You recently put out a very strong statement on China and Hong Kong, and you basically said, there's two systems. One China policy has become a fig leaf for dictatorship. There have been a lot of comments that have been unambiguous about the concerns that the U.S. government and a lot of its allies have about Chinese intellectual property theft. Actions in the South China Sea, actions with sort of techno competition, Huawei, et cetera. And I want to ask this not about China as the boogeyman, but the question of what do you do as a serious way in response? And just as a friendly critique from an outsider, where I see the posture on China where it is, what I'm wondering is if we don't have a domestic alternative to Huawei, what is the U.S. industrial policy plan? What are we doing with allies to put money, technology, resources, defense structures in place so that we're not just posturing and complaining, but we're actually creating a different set of capacity? I know that's somewhat of a loaded question, but I know you and your deputy, Matt Pottinger, think a lot about China and this coming competition, or this competition now. But I'd like to see where the muscle is in that.
Yeah, so it's a great question, Steve, and one of the things that we've done for the past 40 years, and everybody in the foreign policy establishment, is we kind of turned a blind eye to China. If there were human rights abuses, Tiananmen Square, Hong Kong, Tibet, bullying of Taiwan, now the most recent attacks on India on the line of actual control up in the Himalayas, we've turned a blind eye. We've turned a blind eye to Chinese economic activity, the manipulation of the renminbi, the dumping, the unfair trade practices. We've turned a blind eye to intellectual property theft. We've turned a blind eye to all these things, or turned the other cheek, so to speak, because we thought the conventional wisdom, as China became richer, as China became more powerful, they become more like us. And it was really a Western conceit. I mean, I think looking back on it, it was a very arrogant approach to China that they would become wealthy and middle class, and then immediately they become liberal Democrats and quote responsible stakeholders in the world. That obviously hasn't happened, and we can see it with what's happened most recently with what's happened with Hong Kong. They've extinguished freedom in Hong Kong. The Sino-British Declaration had the effect of an international treaty. It's deposited with the UN. We were supposed to have one country, two systems. The people of Hong Kong were supposed to have freedom until at least 2047. And again, the idea was by 2047, China will be a democracy, and so it'll be an easy integration. The freedom was quashed because China couldn't have the competition of a free, prosperous Hong Kong within China that other Chinese could see, as they were being oppressed with a total information awareness surveillance state that's been built, that is something that Stasi in East Germany could have only dreamed of having, with the way that the Chinese people are monitored and assigned social credit scores based on their loyalty to the party or their perceived acquiescence in the party's goals. So they quashed freedom in Hong Kong. What we're trying to do is stop them from doing that internationally. So it's bad enough if the Communist Chinese Party monitors all their own people, creates social credit scores on their own people, hoovers up all their data, whether it's text messages or social media or medical records or financial records. I mean, every intimate photos, every piece of information about a person is collated. And it used to be that you couldn't do much with that because the information was so overwhelming with 1 billion people. It would be like accumulated. It would be like putting it in a warehouse in the old Indiana Jones movie where you had just boxes, and to go try and find it and collate it would be impossible. But now with machine learning, with AI, with the cloud, the Chinese have become very adept at putting together a total surveillance society. They're now moving outside of China to do that around the world. And they want to have a file on every single one of us. And in fact, for many of us, I'm sure you, me, others that are in positions that they think are influential, they already have those files. We know that the Washington Post has been publishing the profiles that they're putting together, and they'll eventually have a social credit score on everybody in the world, and then they'll use that to manipulate us. I mean, we saw what happened with the Houston Rockets when the general manager had the temerity to support the protesters in Hong Kong, and the Houston Rockets were banned from TV in China, and you had other NBA stars groveling to the Chinese, and the NBA groveling to the Chinese. That's how the Chinese want to run the world, and we've got to stop it. And one way we can stop it is by preventing Huawei from becoming the technological backbone of 5G, which would give the Chinese backdoors to pull up every bit of data in the world. And we've been very successful in the Trump administration in stopping that. We've turned countries from the UK to Australia to India to Japan to Italy. Even Germany now is having second thoughts about Huawei. Now, we've got American products that are coming online that are going to be with cloud computing, with companies like Dell and Microsoft and Oracle and others that'll Qualcomm that will have 5G either products or complementary products for 5G. Ericsson and Nokia are Scandinavian countries, are not American companies. I feel like I've been an unpaid spokesperson for Ericsson and Nokia for the last year and a half, and I should probably have a Nokia phone myself, but
and they need support. Look,
it's an incredible thing. But what's happened is the West is slowly awakening to what's happening. We now have dozens and dozens of countries that have decided they're going to work with trusted providers. And what that means is they're not going to have ZTE, they're not going to have Huawei, they're not going to have the Chinese Communist Party in the backbone of their telecommunication systems. And what's been interesting is what's turned them hasn't been they're going to steal your national secrets. They're going to steal U.S. intelligence that we provide you on counterterrorism or on Russian threats or Chinese threats. What's really turned, especially the Europeans, but also many of the Asians, is the fact that their personal private data is going to be owned 100% by the Chinese Communist Party. And think of what you could do with that from a micro-targeting standpoint in an election. If you know if you know their hopes, if you know their fears, if you know who's having an affair, if you know who's been diagnosed with cancer, if you know who's having financial difficulties, if you know what someone's dream vacation is, think of taking all that information and then on a micro basis being able to target that person, to blackmail them, to entice them, to attempt to influence them. If you believe in democracy and you're concerned about our elections, that's the number one concern that we've got going forward, and that all the democracies have, is what China could do with that Huawei backbone in our countries. It's really quite scary.
That's great. Ambassador, I've got 3 quick questions and we've got like 3 minutes. So I want to go, one of the things that may have happened, I don't know, but would love to get your thoughts. We don't have any claims thus far about Russian intervention in this election. So my question is, did Cyber Command, did Paul Nakasone, did your shop send a signal to finally create the first evidence of deterrence in the cyberspace?
Look, we worked very hard on this. We had over 60 PCs and DCs at the NSC. I personally went out to Nikolai Patrushev and met him in Geneva. My Russian counterpart is very close with Vladimir Putin, and let him know that interference in our election day activities would be a red line. And look, the men and women of Cyber Command, but not just Cyber Command. I went out on one occasion to the Iowa National Guard, and they have a cyber unit, and a bunch of smart men and women who are normally CIOs or CTOs for their companies in Iowa, headquartered in those in the great cities of Iowa. On the weekends, they're weekend cyber warriors. They stood up their unit and supported the Iowa Secretary of State. We had that happening with Guard units around the country. So It was a combination of sending out very clear signals to our foreign counterparts, not just Russia, but other countries, China, Iran, others, but also making sure that we'd hardened our infrastructure to the extent we could to avoid that kind of problem.
We're going to have to, eventually have another hour together because I know you're a Navy guy. I know you're thinking a lot about the future of our platforms out there militarily. And I hate asking you in a minute to describe what you think we ought to be doing in terms of reforming the military, looking at our, posture when it comes to ships and, naval craft. But I want to give you that opportunity.
I'll be quick. More subs, more frigates, aircraft carriers with longer reach, with UAVs that can do long range strike from our aircraft carriers that put us out of the A2 AD bubble and allow us to affect the environment. And look, the high ground in the future is going to be space. And the president created the Space Force, the first new branch of the armed forces in 70 years, and cyber. So we're going to have to look at things going forward. We're going to have some short, sharp conflicts that are going to be cyber-driven, space-driven, where the ultimate high ground, and where our Navy and Air Force and Army are going to be interlinked, so that we're using multiple platforms to achieve our ends. We're going to have to be more joint and more focused on cyber and space. Absolutely.
And then finally, you've already sort of referenced it a little bit. I know it's still complicated, but the question is, do you think if things continue as they look, and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris come in and their national security team comes in, are you preparing a healthy transition with them? Are you thinking about that? And then finally, I just want to open the door to any op-eds that you might want to send to the Hill.
Well, I'll still in office, so I'll probably hold off on the op-eds for a while. And I want to give, if there is a new administration, like, they deserve some time to come in and implement their policies. We may have policy disagreements, but look, if the Biden-Harris ticket is determined to be the winner, and it's, obviously things look that way now, we'll have a very professional transition from the National Security Council. There's no question about it. They're going to have very professional folks who are coming in to take these positions, many of whom have been here before and spent a lot of time in the White House in prior administrations. And the great thing is, this is the United States of America. We've passed the baton and had peaceful, successful transitions, even in the most contentious periods. Even I'm old enough to remember Bush v. Gore, and the transition there didn't start until mid-December, and yet it got done. And if we're in a situation where we're not going to a Trump second term, which I think people here where I'm sitting in the White House would like to see, if it's another outcome, it'll be a professional transition. There's no question about it.
Well, Ambassador Robert O'Brien, it's been a real pleasure. And I want to tell people that you can go out and get what he was thinking a few years ago in his book, While America Slept, Restoring Leadership in a World in Crisis. I'm really interested in what the next volume will be, because there certainly, hopefully, will be a next volume. But Ambassador O'Brien, thank you so much. And I want to also thank you on behalf, that powerful video we saw at the beginning, those families. I knew James Foley. James Foley was taken with a colleague of mine from the Atlantic in Libya when my chairman, David Bradley, at that time when I was there, got involved in this thing. And it's just been an ongoing
and by the way,
nightmare for so many people.
David's another great humanitarian who believes in getting our hostages back, and has been a colleague of mine in these efforts as well. And no, look, it was touching and heartwarming to hear from them. And again, we're going to try and get some more folks home before my term ends.
Well, Ambassador, thank you so much, and we look forward to future conversations.
Thank you, Steve. Take care.
Welcome back to everybody. I am having a conversation now with the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Qatar, His Excellency Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani. Your Excellency, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us. I'm sorry we couldn't do this in person as we did last year, but welcome to the forum.
Thank you, Ali, for inviting me today. I'm really glad to have a conversation with you after a year, and I look forward for next year so we can sit together in person.
I look forward to that. You know, we've been asking in the last week or so foreign leaders and ministers of foreign affairs about their response to the U.S. election, and everybody's had something to say. But I think there are a handful of countries where American leadership and American foreign policy is of greater importance than it is to many other countries. And I would say Qatar is one of these countries that you are deeply involved in and to some degree reliant on decisions that America makes, particularly in the Middle East. So I want to start with your response to the U.S. election.
Well, first of all, I think with the U.S. election, the outcome of the election is what the American people are choosing, and we congratulate the new leadership of the country, whether it will be President-elect Joe Biden or President Donald Trump. Our relation with the United States is a strategic partnership that have a strong foundation and have been there now for more than 45 years, which is demonstrated in a lot of forms of partnership, whether it's in defense and security, in economic and business relation, and in the area of education, energy, and the other sectors. With the outcome of the current election, of course, the U.S. policy is not only affecting our region or Qatar, it's affecting the entire globe. And we hope that I'm looking forward to work together with the upcoming administration in order to promote more peace and stability in our region, which is in a real need for it right now with all these tensions around us in the Middle East. And we hope that we will work with them after the transition, and we continue building on our strong partnership, which we have been building over the years. Our relation with the U.S., we don't believe that it will be affected with whoever is the president, because we have built a strong relation within all the institutions of the United States, and our relation is the real institutional partnership and relationship between different departments and different institutions in both countries.
But it was made rocky in the beginning by your neighbors creating alliances with the United States that ended up with a very dangerous blockade for your country. Now that there seems to be some movement in the Middle East, we heard the president's national security advisor telling Steve Clemens just a little while ago that he hopes to get some normalization around the situation having to do with Qatar and the blockade before the inauguration. Is this something you've had discussions about and you believe possible?
Well, we've been discussing this with the President Trump administration for now almost in the last 4 years.
Yeah.
Since the blockade started, and we know that we had a bit bumpy start because of some misinformation and miscommunication that happened with the administration, which have been modified at later stage when we clarified all the positions that Qatar has, and we made it very clear that all these accusations being against Qatar were a false accusation and were part of a disinformation and defamation campaign against my country. We appreciate the efforts that carried out by late Prince Emir Sheikh Sabah Al Ahmed, the Emir of Kuwait, and now carried also by His Highness the Emir of Kuwait, Sheikh Nawaf Al Ahmed, who is continuing the effort of the late Emir of Kuwait, and the continuous support of the US. And we have seen also very strong and significant momentum by the President Trump and his administration, his team, in order to accomplish and to reach a resolution in this crisis. And Qatar have been very open since the beginning for a dialogue which is based on a mutual respect and non-intervention on each other affair and respecting the sovereignty of each country.
Are you concerned that if it doesn't happen before the transition, that it would be different under the Biden administration, or are you satisfied that the Biden administration will straighten these misunderstandings out and resume normal relations with Qatar?
Well, we believe that the desire really need to be driven by the countries who are the parties of the conflict, which is mainly the blockading countries versus Qatar. And we have the desire to find a resolution for a stable GCC in the future, which is needed for this turbulent time in our region. Whether it will end under President Trump or under President Biden, mainly the basis for any solution should be the good intention and good faith of the countries who are the party of the conflict, which Qatar is part of, and we have all the good intention and the good faith to have a constructive engagement with them and to reach to a fair resolution for all the countries. We believe there is no winner out of this crisis, and the only consequence or result of that crisis we have is more instability in our region. If we are serious about our future and about our people, I think we need to put an end and to reach a fair resolution for that crisis. Qatar didn't conduct any hostile activity against the blockading countries, and we are willing, if they have the same willingness to engage on these bases of good faith and good intention, to put an end for this and to reach a fair resolution for our people.
I'm curious about how you feel about these Abrahamic Accords and the deals that this administration has been making with some of your neighbors in the Middle East and with some JCC countries, because at the cornerstone of some of these agreements is a preparedness to sell weaponry and arms to some of your neighbors, mainly to protect against what the United States argues is a major and growing threat from Iran. Your relationship with Iran is very different from that of your immediate neighbors. How does that all play into your thinking about what happens next?
Well, I think the region needs more diplomacy and more diplomatic effort and peaceful effort to resolve these conflicts. And if there is any conflict between the region and Iran, which have been there now for decades between the GCC and Iran, needs to be resolved through a diplomatic resolution. I don't think that the region needs more weapons. More weapons means more instability. It doesn't. We are not saying that you shouldn't build a deterrence forces for your country. You need to build those deterrences, which Qatar is doing the same. But I think we have to invest more in diplomacy and diplomatic resolution with Iran and start to engage more constructively with them. And we have seen there were a lot of efforts in the last year and a half in order to put all parties together to engage. Whether we have seen the initiative of the Iranian, which they call the Hope Initiative. We have seen the initiative of the European for the security of the Gulf and the security of Hormuz Strait. So I think that we need to see more solid vision for the future of our regional security. Regarding the accord and the agreement that UAE and Bahrain have signed with the Israelis for normalization, we have commented from the beginning that Qatar position on that we need to find the core of the issue, the core of the conflict between the region and Israel is the Palestinian issue, and we need to address this at the center of any discussion. The Emirati and the Bahraini decision, it's their own sovereign decision to conduct bilateral relationship, and we don't interfere, and we don't want to comment on this step. I am talking more about the global picture of the Arab region versus Israel. I think it's better to have a united front and to have to put the interest of the Palestinian people to end the occupation and to recognize the two-state solution and to go back to the borders of 1967 with an independent sovereign state of Palestine, with the capital East Jerusalem, as all the international resolution stating. And this is the solution and the vision that Qatar is looking for. We want to see negotiations happening between the Israelis and the Palestinians to put an end for this conflict, because the Palestinian people, they are the ones who are paying for this conflict.
And your country has actually historically been at the forefront of being able to normalize or at least establish relations with Israel, even when some of your neighbors weren't. But in this particular case, no one actually invited the Palestinians to this discussion. They haven't been involved. And there are some people who are worried about the fact that this moment has passed the Palestinians, passed them by. Because if we are able to have these accords with neighbors, without doing all those things you just mentioned, a two-state solution, East Jerusalem as a capital for the Palestinians, and the 1967 borders, if they're not getting it now, and America is able to make deals between Israel and Arab nations, when will they ever get it?
Well, as I mentioned to you, Ali, earlier, that look, for Qatar, when we established the relationship with Israel back in the 90s, it was the outcome of Madrid conference, which the Palestinians were at the center of that conference, and we took the first step when we have seen there were a hope for peace. And when we didn't see a seriousness from the Israelis to engage in a real negotiation and more toward a resolution with the Palestinian, and they have had the war in 2009 when they started to bombard Gaza. Qatar decided to stop this relationship and to continue on the level of working relationship for the cause of Palestinians. And this is the relationship that Qatar maintained with the Israelis up until today. We have communication and we have relationship with them, but about the things which is concerning the Palestinians. So if there are any issues that related to the Palestinians for our humanitarian aid delivery, for our development projects over there, we have to have this working relationship with the Israelis, and we continue carrying it out in the same manner. From our perspective, we see that there is a huge capital being invested by the Arab country in being a one united front to put, to have the leverage over the Israelis to engage in a negotiation with the Palestinians and to reach a resolution. The division is not in the interest of this capital that we have invested, but at the end, as I told you, we don't like anyone to interfere in our sovereign decision. If Qatar decide on relation with any other country, that's why we wouldn't comment on their sovereign decision. It's up to them at the end of the day to decide what they see better for their countries.
Let's go back to the issue of Iran for a moment. When you look at, when you fly on Qatar Airways, without the Iranian airspace, you'd have a big problem. And the National Security Advisor did talk to Steve Clemons about wanting to see that issue resolved fairly quickly. But when it comes to Iran, Iran has indicated that they think that they will be able to normalize, not normalize, but engage in better relations with the United States as a result of this new administration. There's not been a great deal of success between the Trump administration and Iran. What is your role in that? Because the Abrahamic Accords and the things that are going on right now, as I said, are centered around understanding and looking at Iran as a common enemy to Israel, to the GCC, and to America, looking at Iran as a common enemy. That's not a position you take. It's not one you're likely to take. And despite the fact that you don't want anybody to be involved in your own foreign policy, do you have a role to play amongst the GCC and with America in saying, maybe we can have a different relationship with Iran?
Well, Ali, look, from our perspective, Iran is part of our region, it's part of our fabric. It's a fact, it's a reality, it's there. And no one can change this reality or this fact. We have to agree together between the GCC and Iran to live peacefully side by side and to address all the issues in a civilized manner by dialogue and address those differences and disagreements in that manner. And from Qatar point of view, Qatar is a neighbor with Iran, and we have a common interest together as neighbors. We have, for example, the largest gas field in the world is shared between Qatar and Iran, which is called the North Field in Qatar and the South Pars in Iran. We have our airspace, for example, is blockaded from 3 sides, and the Iranian airspace is crucial for us. And Qatar and the Qatari people appreciated the role that Iran played when the crisis started and the blockade started against Qatar, when they opened for us everything. We want to see a resolution for this conflict. We want to encourage the GCC countries to engage positively and constructively, and we want to encourage as well Iran to engage positively and constructively. It doesn't mean that we are going to resolve everything. For the time being, we have disagreements with Iran in some of the policies. It doesn't mean that we are conflicting with each other. Let us talk about the common things and the common interest, and try to address those disagreements by discussion and constructive engagement and constructive dialogue in order to resolve these disagreements. For the US, we've been encouraging them, whether it was Trump administration or we are going to continue this encouragement for the upcoming administration, that we need to have an engagement with Iran in a positive manner to find a formula that we can coexist and we can live side by side peacefully together. We don't want to see a nuclearization for this region. We don't want to see a race for a weapon race in our region and to see more destruction. We want to build on our hopes, on our for our future, for the future of our people and for the next generation, a peaceful environment. Qatar would play any role if we will be asked to do, if this role will be in the diplomacy. Other than that, we want to avoid any conflict in the region. We have put some initiatives forward even before the blockade in 2015, when His Highness the Emir in the General Assembly, he announced an invitation for dialogue between the GCC and Iran. And at that time, Qatar was the chair of the GCC, but unfortunately, we didn't see much enthusiasm in the GCC to engage. Then, during Obama administration, the US administration has also encouraged the GCC to engage with Iran, and the Iranians sent an invitation for dialogue for the GCC countries, and us and some other countries in the GCC, we were very much in favor to have this engagement with Iran, but unfortunately, some others in the GCC, they didn't want to have such an engagement. I think what we need right now, we need wisdom, we need strategic thinking to have a positive and constructive engagement with Iran. And this wouldn't happen without a united GCC resolving this GCC issue and take a step, and we go and talk together with the Iranian in a constructive manner. The same thing we are going to do with the US, we are going to do with everyone, and with the Iranian, that everyone needs to engage positively with each other. We need to reach to a regional security formula that make each side of the Gulf live peacefully and feel that he is still in the comfort zone and he's not exposing himself to any risk.
You were actually a very big part of that comfort zone, that regional security answer, because of the military relationship that Qatar had with the United States. And when the blockade started, that was a real sense of confusion for a lot of people around the world, that you have this very long established relationship with the United States. There were a lot of people who thought, well, obviously the United States is going to get involved within the first few days of the blockade because of that long-standing relationship in which American troops were stationed in Qatar. How has that relationship been affected, and what does that look like going forward?
Well, this relationship have been now for a very long time. We've been hosting the U.S. troops here in Doha, and even troops from all the countries of the members in the coalition against ISIS. Al Udeid Air Base has played a critical role in the campaign against ISIS and have been the main hub and the center of command of the global coalition. And we appreciate this relationship that we have with the US, with the defense, with the US military. And I think that this is critical for the stability of the region, and what we see it from our perspective, that promotes stability in the region and countering terrorism and countering all the malign activity. And we want it to remain as a factor of stability and not a factor for instability.
Let me ask you about Afghanistan. One of the things that the National Security Advisor of the United States was talking to Steve Clemons about is what looks to be an accelerated schedule to pull U.S. presence out of Afghanistan. Now, again, you are one of these parties where, when it comes to Afghanistan, you have been the table at which the Taliban has sat, the other Afghan leaders have sat, the United States has sat. What's your view about the United States looking to pull out almost entirely from Afghanistan? How do you think that leaves your region?
Well, we don't believe in military solution, Ali. We believe always in diplomacy in all type of conflicts. The war in Afghanistan have been now there for decades. In fact, it started 40 years ago, and the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan was almost now concluding at 20 years. And I think the time come to reach to a diplomatic solution. And if there is any way or any road that will lead to a peaceful resolution in Afghanistan or in anywhere in the world, Qatar will pursue that role and will play any role that Qatar will be asked to do if we will be helpful in that. And this is what we have provided for both for the Afghans and the Americans, whether the government or Taliban and the American. And Qatar have provided them with the platform and with the facilitation in these talks. We see that the steps that have been taken until now between the US and Taliban have been, some good steps for the way forward, but it's really the first step for the peace in Afghanistan, because what's more important and more critical is the peace among the Afghans themselves between the government and Taliban, which is still ongoing. And we are still not seeing much progress in that front, and we will keep pushing for that. So we would rather focus on having a resolution among the Afghans right now, which is our priority. And the US is working very closely with us on that matter. And we hope that we can reach to some progress before we see the drawdown of the forces happening, and we see it before the end of this year, hopefully.
And the drawdown of the forces may be before the end of this year, but what does success in Afghanistan look like? When you talk about peace between the parties in Afghanistan, do you see a stable Afghanistan that has a strong enough government to sustain itself and not be a place, a haven for malign activity?
Well, I think first of all, the malign activities of hosting terrorism or facilitating for them training facilities, and the rest of the terrorism issue has been addressed in the US agreement, and there are proper mechanisms to monitor this agreement. But what we are looking for is a peaceful Afghanistan in the future among the Afghans themselves, where they are agreeing to share power together and to also to exchange the power among them peacefully, and to respect the rule of law, respect the good governance in their country, and build for their future. And I'm 100% certain that all the countries of the international community will support them if they are going to embrace these principles. And this is what Qatar and our partners in the Afghan peace process are pursuing right now.
What role is Qatar playing right now in Syria?
Well, right now in Syria, Qatar is politically we maintain the same position, that we see that justice is needed over there. We have seen that There were war crimes being committed against the Syrian people. There were displaced people. There were refugees everywhere in the world, and they need to resolve the core of the issue, which is the political issue in Syria, and to have a political resolution over there. We continue our efforts in the humanitarian front in Syria. We continue providing shelter, providing schools, providing health care for the Syrian refugees and the internal displaced people over there. And we hope that we see more momentum among the international community to help the Syrian people and to reach to a political resolution over there.
Do you share the view that the momentum from the international community has been lost on Syria? This was the top of the agenda. It almost feels like the conversation we were just having about the Palestinians. It's the top of the agenda for a while, and then it just sort of falls off.
Well, I think that, the momentum being lost a few years ago, not just right now, not just this year. And we have seen that, our main problem in Syria, that there've been a lot of red lines being drawn previously, and all of them being crossed, and there were no accountability after crossing these red lines. And right now, maybe if we see the status of war in Syria have been decreased dramatically, but there is a humanitarian crisis and the humanitarian catastrophe over there in Syria needs to be resolved. So we always keep encouraging the international community to engage in a way to bring justice for the Syrian people, and not to forget the accountability, because the bloodshed in the war in Syria have been significant, and I think that we need, and the Syrian people deserve to bring those people who committed the war crimes to justice.
When you talk about the international community, is that code for the United States? Is the United States going to be the deciding factor in what ends up happening in Syria?
Actually, Ali, United States is a key player in most of the issues in the world, given its role in the international community, given its status in the Security Council, because the Security Council is the one who is mandated with maintaining peace and stability, peace and security in the world. And the United States and the other P5 members, they have a responsibility to protect the people in Syria, or to protect them elsewhere in the world, in the conflict zones. So I think US and the other P5, they have a responsibility to take in Syria to reach to a resolution. We hope to see also the partners in the conflict in Syria, or whoever side the countries are supporting, we need to engage in a way to find a resolution for the current crisis.
I know that you're a professional diplomat, so you're not going to speak out of school on these things, but the world is looking at the United States right now. They want to know what the new United States is going to look like, because America has taken what was described as an America first position for the last few years. Some people around the world characterize that as America alone. And now there's some possibility of a reshaping of US foreign policy. So not as a critic, because you don't want to give advice to other countries about how they should run their lives. But as I said to you last year, let's pretend there's no cameras here and this is just you and me talking. What's your contribution to the advice for what America's role in the new world should be?
Well, our advice to the US, whether it's with the current administration or with the future administration, will remain the same. We believe that US leadership is needed in the world, is not only needed in our region. We believe that without a strong international leadership that led also by the United States as our traditional ally here in the region, we cannot reach to a resolution that resolve the conflicts in the Arab world. The Arab world have been fragmented, and you have seen the situation and how the people start to become frustrated everywhere in the Arab countries. So I think US can play a very important role. And what we need from the countries to resolve those conflicts, we just need to have the rule of law clear. We have to have a good governance. We have to address the needs of our people and to give them hope for the future. That's what we need in our region. We don't need more weapons. We don't need more war. We need to combat those terrorist and extremist activities that's happening in our region, that's been actually stealing the revolutions of the people and the demands of the people who have been uprose at the beginning of the Arab Spring, asking for their rights, asking for justice for themselves, and asking for a better future for their children. And all these things, all these demands being hijacked by those terrorists just because we didn't unite ourselves behind the demands of the people and support those demands of the people and making sure that's being fulfilled by their government and there is a good governance in place and there is a rule of law in a place.
You speak about the Arab Spring. Who knew that was going to be the beginning of protests around the world? People who feel that they've been left out of either decisions or the spreading of wealth, or that they get the education that they were told they needed and couldn't get the work that they wanted. Ever since the Arab Spring, we've seen movements like that across Europe, in the United Kingdom, even in America. Arguably, the election of Donald Trump and the protest movements of the last year have all been around that. I have to ask you, as Qataris who really were able to shine a light on what was going on through the Middle East, it's always been an uncomfortable relationship because that democracy doesn't exist in Qatar. So what does that look like? I know you think about it a lot in Qatar. How does Qatar emerge into a world in which democracy continues to assert itself?
Well, I think democracy is not, from our perspective, democracy is not a solution that fits all in the same way. And we are not talking about, we are not preaching for democracy as Qatar, because we are not a democratic country, as you mentioned. But the people in Qatar, they are not disfranchised. They are participating in the decision making, and in fact, we are taking steps for more power sharing with our people. And His Highness the Emir just announced that the election for the parliament will happen next year, next October, and will be the first parliamentary election. And we took this transition in a period of decades. It cannot happen in 1 year. You need to prepare the people. You need to prepare to build a strong foundation for this power sharing and strong governance for that power sharing, in order to make sure that the people are participating in the decision making and not just being disfranchised. And I think that what we have done in Qatar is significant. Until now, we have a constitution that voted by the people 20 years ago. We have an implementation for this constitution. We had first started with the elected municipality councils, and now we are concluding with the parliamentary election for next year. We want the good for the people, whether it's through a democracy or a democratic model, or it's through the model that fit the customs and the nature of the country. And what fits us in Qatar is different than what fits you in the United States or what fits the European. And even it's different than what fits the people in Syria or fits the people in Iraq. And what's happening in Iraq is different than what fits the people in America. So every country has its own characteristic. You cannot preach for a model that's been successful in one country and try to advocate for this exactly the same model on other country. In Qatar, we believe this is the system that fits the nature of our society. And we are going to go through it. We are going to test whatever goes right. We are going to work on it and to continue working on it. Whatever goes wrong, we continue improving and we continue reviewing. And this is an ongoing evolution for any country.
You have, as a country, supported democratic movements in Egypt. You've supported democratic movements in Palestine, in Gaza, and you're a student of history and the student of the world. Do you see a continuum in which a place like Qatar and your neighbors become substantially more democratic, or do you think that system just doesn't apply where you are?
Well, what we see in Qatar, what applies from our perspective and from the perspective of the people when they voted for the constitution is the model of the elected advisory council or the parliament, who will be a part of the decision making in new legislation in Qatar. Things we cannot see that this will suit us for 10 years from now or for 20 years from now. If there are any demands for amendment, it will be seen and tested in the future.
Let me ask you, you brought up a few times that you don't want to see an arms race in your region. I've been amazed in the last 2 months at what looks like an arms race in your region. The weaponry that some of your neighbors are purchasing, Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, these F-35s. I mean, some of your neighbors are buying more F-35s than I would think a major country would even need. What do you make of what's happening around you?
Well, this is a clear indication for sense of insecurity and instability in the region, and this is what we want to end by bringing more hope for diplomacy and giving it more chance for the future. And that's why we've been advocating for a regional security framework that ensuring that everybody is living secure in his country for our future and for the future of our people. So I believe that neither Qatar nor any of the country will need to be in an arms race if there is a proper governance in place in the region, a proper regional governance in place in the region to make sure that we can prevent any conflict from happening. As I mentioned at the beginning, there is no harm of building your deterrence, and all of us need to build deterrence for our countries. Qatar or UAE or any other country, they have the right to build their own forces and own deterrence, but we want it to be built as something that maintain our security in a peaceful environment, not maintaining our security in a very turbulent environment like right now.
Let me ask you about international influence in the region. Obviously, we've seen in Russia we've seen in Syria the Russian influence there. When Qatar had the blockade imposed, in a normal world, you would see other major powers like China or Russia try to impose its influence and get in there. Your situation was different because of the remarkably close relationship, including military relationship, that you had with the United States. But as we continue to see instability in the Middle East, what's your view of the role that the United States plays, Russia plays, China plays? How do you see this all evolving?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, Ali, that if there is a strong regional security framework in place, the relationship with all the forces, with all the countries like Russia, United States, and China will be a constructive, friendly relationship. And we don't want to see excesses in our region, because we don't believe that access in our region will benefit us or will benefit any of the countries in the region, especially for us as a small country. We don't want to be a part of any access in that region. So what we are always encouraging for more regional driven resolution is much better than extending to other international forces. We want to maintain our strong strategic partnership and relationship with the United States. We want to maintain our strategic and trade relationship that we have with China. We want to maintain the same level of relationship with Russia. We want to maintain a good relationship with everybody. We want to be a place where everybody is come and talk to each other and to be united for common goal. We don't want to be a place of differences and disagreements.
I want to ask you about energy, obviously a big topic of conversation for us in the past. We have now an administration likely coming in the United States that is looking to be carbon neutral by 2050. It's a commitment that a lot of countries have made. Natural gas is what everybody talks about as the transitional fuel to getting to a post-carbon world. But how do you think about a post-carbon world? This is obviously something that you've been thinking about a lot in Qatar. What happens to a post-carbon world to a country that is one of the major natural gas suppliers to the world?
Well, I think first of all, the natural gas that Qatar supplies for the world, Qatar supplies almost 30% of the supplies of the LNG in the world, and we believe that it's part of this transition, and we believe that it serves in the interest of that transition. I think all the countries that relying on energy economy needs to build their plans and for the future, for the post-carbon world. Qatar has conducted this exercise of diversification since 2008 when we launched the Qatar National Vision 2030 to diversify our economy away from the hydrocarbon economy, and we have achieved until now. When we started, we were above 80% relying on hydrocarbon in our GDP. Right now, we are at 50%, and we want to continue building on that model for the future. But also, we cannot neglect that the gas will continue, even in the post-carbon world, very important element in the clean energy. And also a part at the core of our strategy to have our impact on not only in Qatar, but on the world, even through our investments, for example, like for QIA, is very much taking this issue very seriously, and its investment to be an impact investor in countries that they are working to achieve this commitment of carbon neutralization. And this have been part of our investments in the past couple of years right now, and we are going to continue expanding on that.
How low can you go? If you've gone from 80 to 50, that's quite a big feat. How low can you go in terms of your GDP dependence on fossil fuels?
Well, our aim from the beginning is to flip it and to have the contribution of the hydrocarbon as minority and the rest of different incomes to be the minority. But this is not a reality right now. It will need time to go into this transition. We built our models in order to minimize as much as possible by 2030, and then post 2030 we will work on new targets for us in the future to make sure that the future generation will not be affected by the Qatari future generation will not be affected by this carbon-free world.
Final question to you. When you and I talk in a year, hopefully we will have had a vaccine for the coronavirus, and we will be able to travel and be in the same place for this conversation. Will the blockade be over, and will you be back in some relationship with your neighbors in the GCC?
Well, we are hopeful that this end, at any moment. And what we need right now is to have a serious engagement in a good faith with the other countries. And this is what Qatar is prepared to do. At any time, they will be ready for this. They will see Qatar ready for this. And as I told you at the beginning, there is no winner out of this crisis, and all of us are losing. And if the crisis will end, all of us will be a winner, and our people will be a winner for the future.
Your Excellency, thank you again for your time. It's a good conversation. We've covered a lot of ground, and we appreciate the time you've taken to talk to us today.
Thank you very much, Ali, for hosting me, and I look forward to see you in person soon.
I look forward to that as well.
Hello and welcome to the forum. My name is Bobby Ghosh. I'm with Bloomberg Opinion. I am delighted to welcome to this conversation Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan from Singapore. He scarcely needs any introductions, but I will go through the motions anyway. Ambassador Kausikan has been a 37-year veteran of the Singaporean Foreign Ministry, and he served in many capacities, including as ambassador to the Russian Federation, as permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. He is now chairman of the Middle East Institute, but my favorite line from his bio runs as follows. It says, the Raffles Institution, the University of Singapore, and Columbia University in New York all attempted to educate him. I think they did a fine job, and I can think of very few people who would be more appropriate for this conversation. We'll try to keep it as conversational as possible. I will speak as little as possible so that we can get the benefit of Ambassador Kausikan's vast experience and wisdom. There's obviously an 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is the American election. So I will start by asking the ambassador, what are your views on overall on the result and what that might mean, not for any specific region, but for diplomacy, for international diplomacy as a whole?
Well, Bobby, American elections, especially presidential elections, but actually any election, are what I call weather events. You can't do anything about the weather. You have to live with it. Whether it's raining, whether it's hot, it's cold, it's wet, it's dry, you live with it, right?
Yeah.
You can adapt yourself to it. You know, you think it's going to rain, you know, for God's sake, bring an umbrella with you, right? But you live with it. That said, I don't think there is any expectation that Mr. Biden is going to fundamentally change the trajectory on core issues. And the core issue is, of course, US-China relations. There's no other issue as important as that.
Yeah.
I think there's a very broad consensus, both in the United States as well as outside the United States, which I include China too, that there is a bipartisan consensus on taking a tougher approach towards China.
Yes.
It's not something Mr. Trump or his advisors one day woke up, you know, in the morning and say, what shall we do today? Let's take a tough approach towards China. No, this has been building up for many years.
Yes.
For basically concerns about Chinese behavior have been building up for many years. And what's particularly important is in the business sector, for all the reasons you know. Now, so I don't expect that it's going to be fundamental change in this core issue.
Yeah, but if you don't mind my...
He will try to fine-tune the relationship. And I can elaborate on that later, but sorry, I interrupted you. You were about to...
No, I was going to interrupt you. Before we go down into the details of China and how China perceives these developments, I wanted to get from you as a diplomat, how important in international diplomacy is tone, is the tone from the White House. And of course, we know that the past year has been a particularly interesting, if I can be polite, tone from the White House, and that's going to change. Is that important, or are fundamental issues just too important for tone to matter at all?
No, tone matters, but we shouldn't exaggerate how much it matters.
Okay.
The substance of issues, the substance of concerns, that is far more important. Tone is, how should I put it? Tone is important, of course, but it's a secondary issue.
Okay.
It's not a core issue.
Okay. So back to China. If you were sitting in Beijing now, if you were a senior Chinese government official, what are you looking for in the next 2 months during the transition period? What signals are you looking for from the Biden camp, if any? And what actions are you expecting from Trump as he heads out of the door?
Well, first of all, I think China, and I think almost everybody in what we now call the Indo-Pacific, would not expect fundamental shifts.
Okay.
What Mr. Biden will do is something in the nature of fine-tuning.
Okay.
Don't forget, and I don't think anybody in China or in Japan or in Singapore, in Australia, anywhere, right, India, will forget that Mr. Biden does not come to the White House with entirely free hands. He has a divided party. The Democratic Party is divided. It still is divided. They contain their divisions while fighting the election, but it will come out again.
Yeah.
The country is divided. Look, there were 70-odd million Americans who thought Mr. Trump was fine. They voted for him, right?
Yeah.
And that's a fact. You can't wish it away, right?
Yes.
And it looks like, of course, the results are not in yet, but it looks like you're going to have a divided Congress.
Yes.
With the Republicans maintaining control of the Senate. And the Republicans and the Democrats losing some seats in the House. So he doesn't have a completely free hand. What he can do, I mean, there are things he can do immediately, and they are not easy, but they are relatively straightforward. He can start working with the WHO again. He can begin the process of rejoining the Paris Accord on climate change. Okay, he can do things like that. And as you said, he can change the tone. He can put into place a more orderly process by which decisions are made and communicated, a more traditional way of communicating American policy rather than tweets and things like that.
Yes.
There can be better coordination with friends and allies. And perhaps, while he can't, at least not immediately, change direction abruptly, he could be less trigger happy about tariffs, about implementing certain regulations, restrictions on China.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think we also should not lose sight of the fact, and I'm sure the Chinese and all of us in this region don't lose sight of the fact, Mr. Biden has made clear his priority is domestic. And that is important because foreign policy begins at home, right? I would put it this way, at least for the first 6, 7, 8, 9 months, he's not only going to be putting his people into place, but he's going to be focusing on domestic issues, how to deal with the economic and health consequences of the pandemic, which is far from over, not just in America, but in the world. And let's put it this way, like say if on a scale of 100, for the first 6 months, I would expect him to spend 80 to 90% of his time on domestic issues. And I would expect nothing else. I'll be, in fact, worried if he didn't do so.
Yeah.
And then the question arises, in that 20%, 10 to 20% that's left, how does he prioritize? There's a whole long agenda of stuff.
Yes.
Not just China. Within the China account, there's a whole long agenda of stuff. But the China account is just one on a long agenda of stuff. Then I think China and all of us will be watching very carefully. First of all, because most of his time is going to be spent on domestic stuff and should be spent on domestic stuff, who he appoints as Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, Secretary of Treasury, the cabinet, but certain cabinet appointments will be very carefully scrutinized. They're always important, but in this circumstance, perhaps more important than normal. Secondly, I think we'll be looking for clues, not just in appointments, but what he says during his inauguration, and perhaps more important, what he says in the first State of the Union. So this is some months ahead, right?
Yes.
But there's also one more factor. He was Mr. Obama's vice president. And therefore, he cannot avoid responsibility for what happened on Obama's watch, whether they are good things and they are bad things. We know all the good things. I mean, in this part of the world, Obama did many good things. It was very soothing, comforting to listen to him talk about pivoting to Asia, paying more attention to Asia. It was quite flattering when he made the time to attend, I think, all but one ASEAN meeting.
Yes.
The opening to Myanmar was a very important masterstroke, actually, I would call it. And the TPP is a really substantive achievement in a region, our region, where trade is strategy. But it was not as if everything before Trump was some kind of pre-lapsarian Eden. There were weaknesses, particularly in the second Obama administration. Weaknesses in the South China Sea, in the Middle East, and so on, which created, and I think it's more than impression, which revealed that he was rather reluctant to use power, hard power, I mean.
Yes.
One of the most damaging things, I'll just give you a few, right? Look, 2012, the Obama administration brokered a disengagement agreement between the Philippines, a US ally, and China over Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea. China promptly broke it. The US did nothing. 2016, Xi Jinping met President Obama and said quite explicitly he would not militarize the South China Sea. Now you can argue about what he really meant by militarize, but the fact is South China Sea has been militarized with a very small fig leaf of using the Coast Guard rather than the PLA Navy.
Yeah.
And in the Middle East, I think this is one of the most damaging things that happened. He drew a red line in Syria and did not enforce it. And that kind of eroded the credibility of American power everywhere. So everything, and Mr. Biden, justly or unjustly, and who says life is fair, is going to be held at least partly culpable with in these things. So every move he makes in the first few months, or maybe the first year or so, is going to be carefully scrutinized. And he will
is it your sense that Biden has a greater appetite for exercising hard power than Obama did? And the corollary question would be, given that now so many years have passed, are the circumstances in those examples that you gave, do the circumstances now allow for an exercise of American hard power?
Why do they not allow? I mean, look, Mr. Trump didn't understand foreign policy. He didn't care to understand foreign policy, but he seemed to have an instinctive feel for power. You look at his business career and all that, right? You can call it bullying, but bullying is a form of power.
Yes.
He exercised it crudely, he exercised it in an incoherent way, but he did exercise it. Now, Mr. Biden is a veteran. I can't remember how many years he served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He knows about foreign policy, he knows about diplomacy, he knows it can't be just about soft power. You need both, right? And he knows that the most dangerous issues in Asia are hard power issues. South China Sea, North Korea, Taiwan Straits, Senkakus, Himalayas. You can't deal with this by soft power.
Right.
No, look, but there was cause to doubt, at least in the second Obama administration, whether some of his appointees understood soft power, hard power. Look, one of the most ill-considered statements I ever heard is Mr. Kerry, who was the Secretary of State in the second administration, criticizing Russia's behavior in the Ukraine as 19th century behavior in the 21st century. Now, I'm not saying there was nothing to criticize about Russian behavior. There's plenty to criticize. But that particular criticism suggested that that was based on the assumption that your competitor, your adversary, your rival should follow your own rules and your own values. Why should they? Unless you have the muscle and the will to exercise it to make them respect your values and your rules. Now, I think we don't want to judge one way or the other, but people will be watching Mr. Biden's every move. friend or foe will be watching to answer the question that you posed.
Yes.
Right? So we don't know yet, but certainly people will watch.
If I can go back to something that you said at the start of this answer, which is that Biden inherits a divided nation, a divided Congress, even a divided world, given how polarized everything has become. But if I were to put it to you that one of the very few things that unites this country, unite the political spectrum, and unite much of the world, not all, but much of the world, is a fear of China. Rational, irrational, deserved, undeserved. That's what going into those issues. But the fact is, China is sort of on top of a lot of people's minds. There has been an expectation of American leadership in responding to China, and there seems to be a sort of a disagreement over whether Trump was leading the world in the right way. Would you agree with that assessment that that's one area where Biden might actually be able to get a consensus at home and abroad?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, there's already a consensus that in the United States that straddles the political divide that America should take a tougher position towards China. And you are absolutely right. I think whatever reservations people around the world may have had on Mr. Trump's means, I think there was a broad consensus on his goals.
Yes.
You can argue whether the means were the best way to achieve those goals, but the goals. And this is because, comes back to your question on tone, right?
Yes.
Why are these, if there is a nascent coalition, global coalition of countries with concerns about China, it's not because of anything Mr. Trump did, it's because of everything Mr. Xi Jinping did.
Yes.
Also, there are concerns about Chinese behavior. Now, not everybody has the same concerns, not everybody has the same intensity of concerns, but the concerns are there.
Yes.
And Mr. Biden, I don't think is going to, as I said, not going to fundamentally shift trajectory, but he can use this. There is a basis, right? For working together, not to put together a containment coalition, because people's attitudes to China are complex.
Yeah.
Right? There is no country, no major economy that I know, or even some minor ones, that doesn't have some concerns about China.
Yeah.
But at the same time, China is a very important part of the world economy, and nobody wants to treat China as an enemy. In fact, it's not an enemy. You know, if I may go on and elaborate this a little bit, I have been very disturbed. I'm very annoyed, I would say, by this loose use of the term New Cold War to describe US-China relations. I think it's a totally inappropriate metaphor. Why? The Soviet Union and China and the United States interacted only peripherally. They led two different systems, and the competition was between two different systems. Now, China and the US are both vital parts of one system, one global economic system, and they are enmeshed in supply chains of a density, of a scope, of a complexity, of an intricacy that have never before been seen in a global economy.
Yes.
Now, this fact conditions their competition and bounds their competition. It makes it much more complicated. Even the United States, right? Look, they have stumbled on a great vulnerability in China, which is semiconductors, right? China is in some trouble. Huawei is in some trouble,
yes.
Right? On the other hand, China is about 40% of the world semiconductor market. You can't just cut it off 100% without hurting your own industries and the industries of your friends and allies. So it's a much more complex situation than the old Cold War, if you like, right?
Right.
And I think that complexity creates opportunity for the new administration to put together a more coherent response to the concerns everybody shares, but also poses some challenges.
We'll get to some of the other countries in Asia and the world and how they would be viewing the change in the White House. But before that, when it comes to implementing American policy, whatever those policies may be, whether it's to China or any other issue in the world, one of the signature achievements is not the right word, but one of the things that the Trump administration did was significantly dismantle the State Department. The principal instrument of American foreign policy was greatly dismantled, weakened. We saw an exodus of professional diplomats. We saw a politicization of what previously would be considered purely diplomatic activity. The appointment of very, very large numbers, much greater proportion of political appointees than any previous administration. As a career diplomat yourself, can you give us an assessment of how badly do you think the State Department has been damaged by this? How easy or difficult will it be to bounce back from it? What are the difficulties that the new administration will face in repairing the State Department?
Look, I mean, I think I ought to apologize to all my friends in the American State Department before I answer this question. So I apologize to all of you in advance. I love you still and so on. Don't take me the wrong way. But I have, from the day I joined the Singapore Foreign Ministry, one of my first jobs was to be the desk officer for America. One thing that struck me from the very beginning was how politicized it was.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true of Republican administrations, Democratic administrations. I know of no other foreign service that routinely, when there's a change of administration, even if it's the same party, changes appointments right down to DAS level and sometimes lower. That's unique to the American system.
Right.
Trump is an extension of that, right? The State Department has survived many such transitions, and there is a great wealth of foreign policy, national security, defense policy talent in the United States, which is at Mr. Biden's disposal, Republican and Democrat, right? So that is not my big worry at all.
Okay.
It's something to think about, but it's not something we should exaggerate to. They will bounce back. They have always bounced back. This may be a bigger bounce necessary, but it's not in principle different from what things they have faced before.
Well, that's reassuring. So back to Asia. We've talked a lot about China. Apart from China now, what are the other major Asian countries, Japan, India? What do you think they will be expecting from a Biden administration in the bilateral sense, but of course also in the sense of the US and China?
Well, first of all, I think Mr. Biden has already made one move. He made phone calls to the leaders of Japan, South Korea, and I think Australia too. Right?
Yeah.
And that's very important because it shows an emphasis on allies. Right? And I think that will be very reassuring to all these countries because what I said vis-a-vis China would also apply to all these countries. The kinds of concerns, the kinds of things people are thinking through.
Yeah.
I would expect him to make a phone call to Mr. Modi very soon. And then he will go down the list. But as I said, you know, I don't expect visits or anything, that pandemic aside, because he has a very strong domestic agenda.
Yeah.
I think the allies, he's taken the first step. He has reassured the allies that, Asian allies, that, you know, he understands the importance of these relationships, and which is not a surprise. As I told you, he's been the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for, you know, I can't even remember how many years, right?
Yeah.
The next step will be to reach out by phone calls or perhaps by trips once he has got his team in place to second-tier countries. I would say they are not allies but friends, right? India, some of the ASEAN countries, and so on, right? And all these countries will be looking at essentially the same things as what I mentioned about China.
Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of the Quad under the Trump administration and where you think that development is going in the next couple of years?
Okay, I think the Quad is a reflection of what I was talking about spreading concerns about certain aspects of Chinese behavior.
Yeah.
Right? Not India, Japan, Australia, US, they don't have exactly the same concerns, and they don't hold them with exactly the same intensity, right? But they have concerns. How the Quad will, what I think is going to change, I mean, Mr. Pompeo's idea of the Quad, of very hard containment, I don't think the other three members are very enthusiastic about it, even close allies like Australia and Japan. For the reasons I mentioned, relationships are not straightforward these days. People have concerns about China. People don't want to make China an enemy, and they have interest in China.
Yeah.
So how it evolves will really depend on the extent to which China will modify its behavior.
Right. And do you expect China to modify its behavior with the new man at the White House?
I think they are taking a wait and see approach. You know that they haven't congratulated Mr. Biden yet.
Yes.
They are waiting for the Electoral College vote, which doesn't mean that they are missing Trump. It means that they are being very, very cautious. Huh?
Yeah.
Right? Because, I think there is a limit to which China can modify its behavior. I tell you why. There is a fact about China that is so obvious that is almost invisible. That fact is that China is a communist country. We often forget that or downplay it. Of course, it's not communist in its ideology anymore. Its ideology is really nationalist.
Yes.
But in the political structure is of a Leninist state, a state in which a vanguard party claims a monopoly of power and control. Right? Now, that fact is the root cause of a lot of the structural issues that other countries find in the economic sphere unfair. Because the party has a privileged position, and the Chinese business, there's no Chinese business that can exist without cultivating a close kind of symbiotic relationship with the party. So of course they will get favors. But what is normal behavior in China is considered unfair everywhere else. So they can, and they're not going, okay, you take, there are concerns about state-owned enterprise, the privileged position. But state-owned enterprises are part of this Leninist system.
Yeah.
And Mr. Xi has emphasized that. Even as he says the private sector is important, he said state-owned enterprises are important. And they are important from his frame. So there will be, you can make tactical adjustments. Some have already been made. For example, you may have noticed that these so-called wolf warriors, who are much more talking to a domestic audience in China than doing what diplomats ought to do, have been toning down their howls. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but these are tactical adjustments. Those can be made. Say the South China Sea. Why do the Chinese have these extravagant claims based on history rather than law? Because the Chinese Communist Party today legitimates itself by a historical narrative of humiliation and redemption under its rule. And part of that narrative of redemption or rejuvenation is, I was weak, I lost these things. I'm strong, I got them back. So they're not going to back down. They can't, without undermining their own nationalist ideology. And I can give you more examples, but I think I made the point. I don't want to belabor it. So they can adjust. They are very flexible. They're not like the Soviet Communist Party that was very rigid. They can adjust, but around the periphery. And in a way, Mr. Xi Jinping has made it more difficult to adjust because of his concentration of power, because of the severe penalties because of his renewed emphasis on party control, party discipline, and so on. He has introduced some new vulnerabilities into the Chinese system. They are not fatal vulnerabilities, I want to emphasize that. But, let's not expect them to, okay, let's put it this way. Before Mr. Trump, all was not good. After Mr. Trump, all will not be good.
Can you expand a little on those vulnerabilities that you were talking about?
Okay, I give you one. This is a central core vulnerability.
Yeah.
Of China, right? As early as the 18th Party Congress, and in fact, even earlier, 2007 or 2008, then Premier Wen Zhaopao said more or less the same thing. At this 18th Congress, which was 2012, the Chinese Communist Party acknowledged publicly that the growth model that had created the spectacular growth of the 1990s, early 2000s was not sustainable. And a new growth model was needed. The next year, 2013, they rolled out their new growth model, which envisaged a decisive role for the market. That term, decisive role, is theirs, not mine, right? But implementation has, to put it kindly, been patchy and hesitant. Why? Because the essence of the new model was they acknowledged they needed more market efficiency, right? Instead of just relying on infrastructure investment, led by state-owned enterprise and so on. They need to make better use, improve productivity, make better use of resources. But market and control are almost diametrically opposed concepts.
Yes.
And the primary value of a Leninist party, which the Chinese Communist Party is control. Now, these are not, the choice is not absolute. It's what balance between control and market efficiency. And that's not so easy to determine. And it requires some risks. And there, so far, under Mr. Xi, the balance has been towards control. There's been some market reform, particularly in the financial sector, but even there, recently, you saw what happened to Mr. Jack Ma.
Yes.
There were good technical reasons, I would say, for stopping the IPO, right? But it was also a reminder to him who is boss.
Boss, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, since you now run the Middle East Institute, I think it would be good to hear your views on how you think the dynamic of the Middle East in the last 4 or 5 years, is that, like the dynamic with China, is that also something that it's too late for the United States to change? Has it now taken on its own logic and its own inevitable motion? Or is there something you feel that a Biden administration might be able to do to slow down the process, change the direction? What do you think?
Well, it depends how you define the dynamic.
Well, let's split it up.
Our definition may not be the same.
Yeah, let's break this down. Let's start with, let's say, so in three areas. So the Gulf states and their evolution and the development of their hostility with Iran. Turkey at the other end of the picture. Turkey's increasingly sort of separate position from the Western consensus, from NATO, and in the middle of these two, the Levant, so the developments in Syria primarily. So if we can think about these three categories, what do you think that the Biden administration might be able to do to change any dynamic there?
Okay, first of all, I think beyond these three categories, there are bigger macro forces or macro factors. One is, I think, the kind of involvement in ground wars in the Middle East has been widely acknowledged as a mistake.
Yes.
And what links the Obama administration to the Trump administration is the desire to pull back from that overextension, right? Obama did it in a hesitant way. Trump did it in a kind of an ill-considered way, right? But it's the same. Second, and that's, I don't think, going to change because the nature of American interests in the Middle East has changed. You are not longer, the Quincy Accord, the basis of the Quincy Accord doesn't hold because you don't need that energy as vitally as you used to need, right? And that's not going to change because that's for a variety of technical, technological, ecological, political factors, that trajectory is more or less set. It can go faster, it can go slower, but it's set. So I don't think, so the changes, I will say that even in my own institute, not everybody agrees with me, and they shouldn't, right? But I don't think there's going to be, again, fundamental change. There will be fine-tuning.
Okay.
In this respect. I think the pulling back from an overextension to being an offshore balancer
right.
is going to continue. I don't think, this has been wrongly described, I think, when Trump was president, or when Trump is still president, during the Trump administration, as a retreat from the Middle East. I would say it's a recalibration of his engagement of the Middle East. Because I don't see the Fifth Fleet leaving Bahrain. I don't see the US Air Force leaving Qatar, right? Okay, so, but those are offshore balancing forces instead of getting involved in ground forces. That will continue. Second, what you mentioned, the divide between the Sunni Arab states and Iran predates Trump, predates Obama. It goes back, perhaps you can say, to even predates the Iranian Revolution, although that is accelerated. You could go back to maybe the 73 war, and right, and or even earlier. You can go back to Saudis emphasizing Wahhabism, at least, as a counter to Nasser's Arab nationalism, which is not only secular, it was also Republican.
Yes.
But, okay, the Iran Revolution accelerating. So this is a long-term trend. And it poses, I think, a dilemma and a challenge for a Biden administration's Middle East policy. First of all, don't forget that Biden has a long-standing relationship with Israel. He is a long-standing supporter of Israeli security, and I don't think that's going to change. Right? He may make some gestures which Trump was not prepared to do towards the Palestinians. But that's another issue because the Palestinians have a lot of responsibility on their own shoulders.
Yes.
Okay. But at the same time, he has said during the campaign, which is probably not the best, what he said during the campaign is not always a very good indicator of policy. But anyway, he said it, that he wants to somehow come back to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Now that's much easier said than done, particularly if the Republicans hold the Senate, right? And don't forget there is a election in Iran next year.
That's right.
Right, and all that has happened, I think, in my judgment, has strengthened the hand of those who are those in Iran who are not very enthusiastic about the JCPOA in the first place, right? So, but at the same time, he has also said, and I think he means it too, that he wants to encourage more Arab states to reach out to Israel. Now, the reason the Arab states are reaching out to Israel is Iran. So there is a certain contradiction in the goals he wants to pursue. How he will pursue it, I don't know. Now, to come back to your framework, right? Now, look at the Middle East coldly and clinically. Let's look at it clinically. There is a northern tier, and there's the Gulf, and there's North Africa. I'll leave North Africa minus Egypt out of this for a minute, right? If you look at the northern tier, Iraq is a failed state. Syria is a failed state. Lebanon is a failed state, right? Turkey and Iran had fairly decent economies, but due to mismanagement, they are in dire straits right now. these are not things that any administration can fix. In fact, in the northern tier, the only viable real economy is Israel.
Yes.
Right? Jordan is fragile, Egypt is fragile. Right? The Gulf is more interesting in the sense. Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman is undertaking a bold experiment. Economic diversification away from dependence on a single commodity, which cannot be done without social changes, cultural changes, and so on, and some are already in place. One of my last trips before we all got locked up in our own countries was to the Gulf and to Saudi Arabia. I had not been there for 8 years. This was last September, November. And I was quite impressed by some of the things I saw. I saw women not covering their heads anymore. Not a whole lot of them, but some don't, right? Mm-hmm. I saw women working. And not working. By working, I don't mean serving tea. I mean real work, right? And those are good things. So I think what is being attempted in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is the key. I mean, UAE has done this long ago. Qatar has done this long ago. Oman has done this long ago. Kuwait, in a more hesitant way, it has done it, right? But the key is Saudi Arabia, right? And I think no right-thinking person would want them to fail, but any clinical person would have questions about whether they will succeed.
Well, since you brought up Saudi Arabia,
again, that's not something that America can help very much.
Yeah, I take your point. I take your point on that. But since you brought up Saudi Arabia and MBS, so much of the relationship between the Saudis and the US in the last 4 years has been intensely personal. It's MBS and the Trump family. That now changes. There is not a Biden family relationship with MBS. How does that change the calculus for Saudi Arabia, do you think?
Well, I think they will have less leeway. They will have to, I think human rights will play a larger role in the agenda of US-Saudi relations.
Yeah.
Khashoggi and all that sort of stuff, right?
Yes.
But I think it is still a key player in the Gulf. You can't get away from that, right? And any American administration, even as it recalibrates the way it engages the Middle East, will have to deal with Saudi Arabia in some way. It won't have that kind of personal blank check approach that Trump adopted, right? But it's still going to be an important partner in the Middle East. No getting away from it.
Should we expect more American pressure for a resolution to the split within the GCC countries between Qatar and the others?
Well, I think the Trump administration did try after its initial thing. It did try. It didn't work because again, I think we shouldn't exaggerate the extent to which people. All right, look, put it this way: every major power, US, Soviet Union, before them Britain, France, right? They always gone to the Middle East and never been able to control the dynamic.
No.
The tail always wags the dog. Because these countries are complex countries, they have their own internal dynamics where outsiders can have only a limited influence.
Right.
And I think that will be true of Biden. It was true even on during Trump's time. The only difference is he didn't particularly care.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's going to change very much. I think there will be a slightly more, there won't be a blank check anymore, right? There will be a bit more emphasis on human rights. There will be more, but I think I can't see any American administration not supporting the kind of reforms that the Saudi leadership says it wants to make.
Well, I think I've just got my cue. We're down to less than a minute now, so I want to take this time to thank you, Ambassador, for sharing your insight with us. Thank you for joining us in this conversation. I'm sure the audience will have gained a great deal of understanding. of the world when it's seen from a different vantage point than many are used to. Thank you very much again.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Bobby. I'm glad to meet you, and I hope to meet you in person before too long.
Inshallah, as they say in Delaware.
Inshallah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hello, my name is Jason Blazakis, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Soufan Center. It is a great honor to conclude the first day of our event. Former Senator Joseph Donnelly, the chairman of the board for the Soufan Center, kicked off our discussion by highlighting some of the key challenges the international community has faced during 2020, ranging from the outbreak of a global pandemic to increasing societal discord because of the rise of disinformation. These issues and many others have shaped the boundaries of the online and offline worlds we now inhabit. Following Senator Donnelly's opening remarks, Steve Clemens, editor-at-large for The Hill, and Ambassador Robert O'Brien Jr. had an engaging conversation on the issues of U.S. foreign policy and global security. Ambassador O'Brien, who serves as President Trump's national security advisor, described how the America First approach could be witnessed through the Trump administration's prioritization of bringing home American hostages, whether they have been held captive by transnational actors or illegally detained by foreign powers. Because hostage recovery was such a key priority for the Trump administration, 56 hostages and detainees in more than 24 countries were successfully rescued. Ambassador O'Brien also highlighted some of the administration's successes in countering terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIL, both of whom pose a diminished threat to international peace and security. In his illuminating talk with MSNBC anchor Ali Velshi, His Excellency Sheikh Mohammed Abdulrahman Al Thani, the foreign minister for the state of Qatar, emphasized the need for diplomatic solutions throughout the world, to include the Persian Gulf, Syria, and Afghanistan. In the region, the foreign minister emphasized that Iran is indeed a part of the region. It is a fact and a reality that will not change. It is also, according to the foreign minister, incumbent upon the Gulf Cooperation Council states not only to resolve their own differences, but also to work to achieve peaceful solutions with Iran. One major concern expressed by the foreign minister was the expanding arms race in the Gulf and the broader Middle East. The rapid expansion of military power is a key source of instability, and that is why Qatar continues to advocate for a regional security framework. As Ali Velshi and the foreign minister's conversation pivoted from regional conflicts to a discussion on Qatar's energy capacity, the foreign minister explained that Qatar's natural gas reserves will be a key to the world's ultimate transition to a post-carbon world. Our day concluded with a lively discussion between Bloomberg journalist Bobby Ghosh and Ambassador Bilahari Kaushik, the former permanent secretary of the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador Kaushik's characterization of the recent U.S. election was particularly apt. He said that U.S. elections are like weather events. You can't do anything about it, you just live with it. On a more serious note, Ambassador Kaushik emphasized that President-elect Biden will face a wide range of security challenges when he takes office in January of 2021. The ambassador explained that an emboldened China will continue its militarization of the South China Sea. At the same time, the critical security problems in the Taiwan Straits and the Himalayas will endure, and that these challenges, like many others in Asia, such as North Korea's nuclear program, are issues that are unlikely to be resolved solely through the use of soft power tactics. I hope you'll be back tomorrow. Tomorrow's theme, From Theory to Practice, how to think about regional and national security challenges, will feature a fantastic set of speakers from government, academia, and the multilateral community. I have no doubt that you will, like today, learn more about our world, difficult national security challenges, and the innovative ideas that will be needed to be implemented to ensure that we can live in a safer and more prosperous world. Thank you for attending, and see you all tomorrow.